Hello, this is Kevin Bowersox, creator of the blog 2Thought. In today's tutorial, we will explore using the JPA Criteria API to retrieve data from an object model. The Criteria API is an interface used to construct queries that can be executed by a JPA provider. The API can be used as an alternative to JPQL and contains a superset of the features which may not be included in JPQL. Instead of expressing our queries in JPQL strings, we can programmatically build our queries using the API, which provides us with greater type safety. I invite you to follow along with today's tutorial by downloading the codebase we'll be working with, which is available via this GitHub repository link below the Criteria API introduction article. Once our tutorial is complete, you can download the full source code by clicking the GitHub icon below the article. To begin, I'd like to give a quick overview of the data model and the object model for those who may not be familiar with the structure of these tutorials. Within our data model, you'll see we have a table post, and post basically corresponds with a blog post. You'll notice the author and email fields or columns on the post table. We'll take a look at those in a minute. And then there's also the post part table, which contains the content of the post in the body column. So we'll switch over to our object model and look at the post entity. And within the post entity, we see that it extends an abstract post, and we see that an abstract post contains this embedded entity stamp. Within stamp, you'll notice the author, email, and created date fields. And that'll be important as we write queries using the Criteria API so you understand the data model. So let's get started using the Criteria API. I'm going to create a new unit test. We won't actually be doing any testing, but it's a quick way to get Spring configured. I'm going to call it Criteria API test, and then I'm just going to grab some configuration for Spring test so that we can leverage the JPA provider, which is Hibernate in this instance. And the first query we're going to run using the Criteria API is a simple select. And this select will have a where clause that will filter posts only for me. So we create a criteria builder. Oops, I need to auto wire an entity manager. Whoops. We'll import those. And from the entity manager, we call get criteria builder. And then we create a criteria query. We give it a generic type of post. And we can specify the class for the criteria builder. We'll have to import that. And then we create a root, which also has a generic type argument. And we specify what entity we would like to select from. We'll import those. And now we can add the conditional clause using the select method. We see that that takes a selection object. and we want to select from the post root, and we use the where method, and then our criteria builder allows us to specify the condition. And in this case, if you remember, we need to grab the stamp entity, and then within that we want to get our author field. And now, so we're saying that in our where clause we want to basically from post grab the stamp and look at the author field, and now we need to specify the token we want to compare that against. So I'm going to put my name in there. Let's see if we can format that a little bit more nicely. It's not too great, but that'll do. Okay, and now we can create a typed query, specify the generic type arguments, and then, we can tell we're going to have a name conflict there, and then we'll use the entity manager to create the query from the criteria builder, the query the criteria builder provided us. So we pass that in. That's going to make our typed query, and then we can grab the posts by executing that query. We'll grab the result list, we'll import the list, and then we can iterate through the posts and we'll print out the title and the author. So we created a simple query with the criteria builder that selects all posts where the author is Kevin Bowersocks. Let's see if this works. We'll execute it. Whoops. Okay, we can see that all of the posts that were created by me were returned. So we use the criteria builder to perform our first query. Now I'd like to show you the same query using JPQL. So I created a new test method, and we'll create a new typed query. And this is where our query will go. And then we need to provide the type, which will be a post.class. So using JPQL, we can select p.stamp.author, if I spell it correctly, and p.title from post p, and now we need to specify our where clause. And you'll notice I didn't use the parameters here. Obviously that's a bad practice because we're exposing ourselves to SQL injection. But just for this example, I'm using the hard-coded parameters. So, and just to save time, I'm just going to copy this code. Change that to query. So that will print out all of the posts that we've retrieved. And let's not run this method. So we'll comment everything out. And we'll run through this. And it looks like there must be an issue with my JPQL statement. Let's just select the, there we go. I was selecting two different fields from post instead of the actual post. So you'll notice there we've retrieved the same data using JPQL. This JPQL query is equivalent to all of this criteria builder code. Now let's create a little bit more complex of a query. So I'm just going to comment, I'm going to comment out this method. And we'll create a new test method. And in this method, we're going to use the Criteria API to perform a join. So to start out, we need a criteria builder. It's already imported for us. And then we need a criteria query. And because I'm not going to return the whole entity, I need to specify its generic type argument as an object array. We'll create our query, and we'll specify an object array as its type. Now we need to create another root. And specify the class for that root. And since we're selecting multiple columns, we need to use the multi-select method to specify what we would like to return. So I'm going to get the stamp from post, and I'm going to get the author field from the stamp, and now we'll specify our next column, which is going to come from the post part. We're going to get the body field or column. Now you'll notice we're getting an error on post part because we need to perform the join. So we specify the two entities that we want to join in the generic type arguments of the join object, and then we use the post root to join the post part. We specify the field we want to join to. Within our entity post, we have a post part field which has a join column and a relationship set up via JPA, and we're going to utilize that to create our join. Perform our imports. And now we need to create our query with the entity manager. import query. And now we'll get our list of object arrays. And we'll execute that query. And now we'll iterate through the object array, which represents the columns or fields returned from executing our query. And then we will output these fields using simple print statements. And let's execute this query. So there you can see we got the author along with the body of the post in post part using a join via the Criteria API. The join is established here, and then we've also used this new multi-select method. So when we don't want to return a whole entity, we use multi-select to specify the fields we want to return, and we use the roots along with the get method to pull the attributes. And as you can see, in almost like a builder type fashion, we can but we can chain these method calls to access different fields within other fields. So stamp is a field on post, and author is a field on stamp. So that's how we're pulling that out. And we can specify multiple fields that we would like to return. Again, I would like to demonstrate the JPQL equivalent of this query. So I'll create a new test, and we'll create a new query. Oops, that needs to be a string literal. So we'll select p.stamp.author, and we'll specify that we want to join a post part. There we'll have our query. Let me just look over that quick. So we're selecting the author through the stamp embeddable, and we're selecting the body from the post part. We join the post to the post part, and now it's as simple as retrieving our list of object arrays from that query, and now we iterate through that list, and we'll print out the first field and the first field, or in the second field. I got caught up with the zero indexing there. So let's now execute this query. And we have an issue. Let's take a look at that quick. So we have something wrong in our JPQL. I can't just specify that like SQL, I believe. Okay, so once I made the criteria or the join properly through JPQL, by specifying the alias for this entity and then the field. So I'm leveraging that relationship we've defined in our annotations. It works properly. You can see, just like the last one, we got the author and the post body. So here would be that query using the Criteria API, and here's that same query using JPQL. So I'm just going to comment that out. Whoops, I think I deleted it. There we go. Now it's commented, and we'll move on to our next example. Our final query through the Criteria API will be a little bit more advanced. And because we'll be performing an aggregate query, please don't check my spelling on that. So we need a criteria builder. We'll get one through the entity manager. Then we create a query, and we're going to be returning two fields in our select. So we specify an object array. We use the criteria builder to create a query. Oops. And we need to specify that this query returns an object array. And now we need a root, and we'll provide the post as a generic type argument. We specify where we would like to select from for our root. And now we can begin to build our query. We use a multi-select since we want to select more than one column. And through the post root, we will get the stamp. And then through the stamp, we will get the author. And then we can specify our aggregate function, which we'll be using a count. And we want to get a count of the posts. So we specify the post entity. And now we can add our group by expression. And we'll use the post root to get the stamp, through which we will get the author. Okay. Let me format that so it's a little bit more readable for you. So there you can see we're retrieving two fields, one of which is a count of the post, the other is the author's name. So we're showing how many posts an author made, and then we can group by the author using the group by function. Now we can create a query. Use the entity manager, and we'll pass in the query we've just constructed. And now we're going to get a list of object arrays, where the object arrays will correspond with the fields we've selected. And now we can iterate through our object arrays. We'll print the first field and the second field, so that's the name and then the count. So let's give this a shot. Okay, so here we can see how many posts each author has made using the aggregate query we've constructed with the Criteria API. So I'm going to comment this out because we're going to show the same query now using JPQL. Okay, so we need another public test method. We'll call that Aggregate JPQL. And now we need to create a query. And within our query, we'll grab the author. And then we can use the count aggregate function. We specify the group by. Once again, we go through the stamp to get the author. Let me split that up so you can view it better. And now we can get our list of objects. And actually, this is going to be about the same as what we did right here. So I'm just going to copy that code quickly. Okay. So here we retrieve our result set, our result list, and then we iterate through it, printing out the author name and the count. Okay, and we get the same results as we expected. So this portion of code would be equivalent to this query executed using the Criteria API. So here we have the API, here we have JPQL. So that wraps up today's tutorial. Just to recap, we constructed 6 different queries, 3 with the Criteria API and 3 with JPQL. Our queries range from a simple select with a where clause to a join to an aggregate function. And one thing I hope you noticed throughout this is the difference between the Criteria API and JPQL. Obviously, the JPQL was a lot more terse. In my opinion, it's more readable and more usable. The argument for the Criteria API is the type safety. You'll notice we're basically specifying a string using JPQL, and some will make the argument that if we change the type of different fields or an entity, we do some modifications, these queries using JPQL will not give us compile time exceptions, while the Criteria API will give us compile time exceptions. But you'll notice I am using strings within the Criteria API, so we're exposed to the same issue. Where JPA makes up for that is by giving you the ability through some JPA providers to create a meta model, which basically allows you to look at your entities and create meta information about them that includes their type. So if we were to change something in one of our entities, we will receive a compile time error using the Criteria API if we have that meta model information. The benefit in my mind of that is debatable. If you have properly established unit tests, you're going to be able to discover those type issues when your tests break. However, if you don't have them, you may notice the issues at runtime. So it's a little bit of preference, which approach you go with. I prefer JPQL. Don't let that stop you from exploring the Criteria API and the meta models. I'd be interested to see if anybody could make some good examples or tutorials with those. So I hope you enjoyed today's tutorial. I'll work on the next one. I think we're going to head away from JPQL and JPA, and look how Spring Data simplifies some of this work that we've been doing through the past 3 or 4 tutorials. This whole exploration of JPA was to establish that foundation so we could intelligently look at Spring Data and see the value it's providing us. I wouldn't hesitate to use straight JPA. It is very powerful, but I think you'll see that some of the introductions that Spring Data makes make it even more powerful and more usable. So that's all for today. Thanks for tuning in.